Hey, Insync, good to see
Hey,
you.
what's up, man?
Yeah, not too much. Chatting with you today about some of your recent essays. You did two,
Yeah.
one on contra materialism and one contra idealism, which is an interesting and controversial position because so often we find that someone will choose one or the other of those two particular positions. It's rare
Yeah.
to find explicitly not those positions in kind of well, if someone even is explicit with their metaphysics. But yeah, I'd love to start with the materialism essay. We can kind of go through some of your arguments. Yeah, so let's just dive right in. One of the things that you mention as a criticism of materialism is that matter in itself is not very well defined. Like it kind of becomes a circular explanation or description of what matter is, whether we call it energy or matter. It's kind of what is that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of seems like, every few years we have a breakthrough and then we sort of there's a new layer to matter where we're like, okay, this is the stuff, this is the real stuff, the things it's made of. And um, you know, uh even if let's say we find reach a stopping point with smaller parts or something like that, then there's the problem of explaining what physics, is really talking about. Like our best physical theories seem at odds with one another, and even were they not at odds with one another, the range of interpretations that can be given to what that can be given in natural language to what's being talked about in the math. I think it's a big question. What really is this? What are we even saying? Like, what are we committed to when we're saying that everything is made of physics or everything is made of whatever the stuff of physics is? What does that even mean?
Right. As there's sense of contingency within the explanations, even like no matter how much we cut the atom down to smaller components or cut the particles down to components or cut the quarks down to smaller components, we're always left with this sense of like small beads of some kind of that we can cut further and further and further. And there's this, potential for an infinite regression there of cutting and smaller pieces. But actually quantum mechanics doesn't allow us to do that. There's some point where in scale where we get to a place where we can't cut and the idea of matter sort of breaks down, even in the kind of quantum foam, as they call it, these virtual particles that kind of pop in and out of existence and
Mhm.
um, probabilities that make the idea of matter and what we normally think of as small beads stop making sense. Things become more wave-like and dispersed, and you can't really call. I mean, energy fits with waves a little bit more than matter, but we also stop getting things like mass. So yeah, what do we do then? If how do we could always redefine matter as something more wave-like, but then if we've kind of moved the goalposts in that sense, and it stops making sense to calling it matter at some point.
Yeah, and even if there is like, I'm not closed off to the idea that some brilliant physicist who happens to be also pretty good at English or whatever the language of the future might be, could be capable of translating a lot of that into a tractable form. But as you sort of touched on at the beginning there, um, there's something about it that falls short of a final explanation in that it's all contingent, and that as far as I've ever been able to tell, there's no way of giving an explanation in terms of an appeal to physical forces or fields or whatever the primitive notion is. One can always ask, well, why is it that way rather than some other way it in principle could have been? And it doesn't seem like physics is capable of furnishing an answer to a question like that.
Right. Can you explain more? Like, why not?
I think just because the nature of the kinds of things that physics talks about being sort of um uh yeah, I guess ways that the world works that aren't self-sufficient. Maybe there's a kind of physical notion, hitherto unimagined, that would be non-contingent. But at that point, as soon as we start talking about something non-contingent, I would argue we've left the realm of physical explanation and we've started to talk about something metaphysical.
Right. There's also an attitude, I think, in people who appeal to physicalism or prefer physicalism, that they don't like metaphysics. They don't like philosophy. It's almost like there's a modern trend to reject philosophy outright because we just do the math and we just do the empirical findings and,
Shut
and
up
we
and
just
calculate, right?
yeah. So there's almost like the appeal to physicalism is somewhat a rejection of metaphysics. And even if we were to, try and open the doorways to more of a metaphysical, non-contingent exploration, it also seems like the physicalist's argument might be like, well, physicalism is a thing that we use to make practical use of the world. So why even bother? It's almost like appealing to some kind of pragmatism as a philosophy. Like, I only bother thinking about things if I know that they're going to be pragmatic in some specific sense.
Exactly. And I think, one of the reasons, especially in modernity, although this trend in thought has a long history, but one of the reasons that metaphysics tends to get a bad rap, I think, is because it's not empirically accessible. Like we can have, in some sense, whatever metaphysics we like, and the predictions come out the same, and there's no direct way of doing an experiment to determine whether one metaphysical framework is correct and whether another one is wrong. And and it does come down to a kind of pragmatism, like, oh well, physicalism is just basically the point of view that metaphysics is not necessary in order to explain the world, or at the very least to describe and predict the world. But I think there's a gap between those two modes of intellectual engagement. Explanation seeks to eliminate mystery, whereas description and prediction just aim to give us an adequate account to get by. And I think the fundamental intellectual impulse is towards explanation. We happen to like description and prediction because, like you said, they're very useful, and also they're sort of accessible. Like we can do that. It's easy enough. Not that physics is easy, but it's actually doable in that sense, and we can turn that into things that measurably increase the quality of life. Whereas, there's this thought about metaphysics that it's kind of off in the clouds, armchair philosophizing about what might as well be nothing, I think, is the usual thought.
Yeah. So what do you think is required in the minds of physicalists for that to change? Do you think that there's some kind of way of exploring metaphysics that might draw people in that otherwise wouldn't be interested?
Yeah, I think that maybe, generally what I try to emphasize is what I was just sort of mentioning, which is that there's an explanatory gap and that intellectual honesty in some sense demands us to make an attempt to answer a question like that. And in fact, I've had a fair amount of success speaking with physicalists who, it's not a short process, but eventually come to realize that whether you make it explicit or not, everybody's got a metaphysics. You can't get away from having that. But that tends to be a laborious process, quite drawn out to get them to that point, because you basically have to engage them in debates, conversations, arguments where you repeatedly gesture towards the limitations of a view like that. And my experience is that the only people worthy of having that conversation with tend to be smart as a whip and capable of procedurally updating it to kind of um, what would you call it? What's it called when you retcon? To kind of they kind of like change, update, in response to the critique. Which, I mean, fair enough. You know what I mean? But it kind of, the thing about that is that it erases. You point to this is the flaw, and then they kind of like halfway fill that in, and you're like, fuck, now that's really difficult to point to. All right, what about this? And you kind of go through the motions, and it's really up to them at a certain point to go away and realize, okay, in this process of arguing, I've actually moved a lot, and what does that amount to? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's potentially inroads in the future, in terms of when we do conceive of grand unified theory of physics, which I think in some sense is an inevitability, to be honest with you. I think there will still be open questions as to what interpretation should be given to that. So similarly as to what we see with quantum physics, what is the appropriate way to talk to ourselves about what the mathematics is saying or doing?
Right.
And I think the various ways of resolving that question involve different metaphysical commitments. So once there's nothing left to do in terms of the physical description and prediction, I think science will inevitably have a metaphysical turn, because it's a progressive filling out of the details, and so once there's no more details left in the most immediate part of the model, anyone who's got a mind to add something is going to turn towards, okay, let's say I prefer this or that interpretation. How do I make that make sense? And how do I convince other people that that's actually going to be true? And that's going to involve identifying that it consists of a set of implicit metaphysical commitments and finding a way to motivate those commitments.
Well, it sounds like you're probably more hopeful about that than I am, or at least I can't see that in the foreseeable future, just because of the kind of careerism and implicit commitment to physicalism that so much of our common sense science, like the science that's presented to the world on like chat shows or whatever, is all physicalist interpretations. Yeah. It's very rare to find someone like Sean Carroll, interestingly enough, feels like he's done a bit of a switch towards more open to like holographic theories and things like that. And we've got people like Sabrina Hostenfelder who, talks about these different models, and PBS Spacetime talks about these different models. But often they're either non-committal, like I think PBS feel like it's hard to tell what Matt on PBS really believes himself, but he definitely seems to be a bit more of a physicalist at heart. And then Sabine obviously is, was it supersymmetry, has some kind of commitments there, which are also physicalist in some sense.
I think so Sabina is a good example actually of Sabina is a good example of someone who is reticent to engage in metaphysical speculation, but self-aware. And this is what I've found in the kind of person who can be turned towards metaphysics, is she explicitly describes herself as an instrumentalist. That's a type of pragmatist who basically cares about what tools work. I want the tool that works. And it's just there's a conversation there to be had about what does it mean for a tool to work? What conditions does a tool have to meet to work? I mean, and I think it's quite an easy conversation once someone has that self-awareness about how am I describing my position? What sort of commitments does this entail? Being consistent with that. Because, for example, a hammer works because it's the surface that it strikes with matches the surface of a nail. A screwdriver works because the surface it uses matches the surface of the screw. There's a kind of complementarity to these designs where one has to match up with the other. And that seems to me straightforwardly a certain kind of correspondence. I mean, you can say, I just care about the tool that works, but implicit in that is a sort of set of commitments about what it means for a tool to work and why some tools obviously don't work, and so there's a conversation to be had there where you can kind of unpack the implications of that way of thinking. Um, as to, I guess, being hopeful about the way I see it is that, we're living in a time of exponentially increasing democratization of knowledge. You think 200 years ago, and science was something for rich people to do in their spare time. Um, Not many, if any, average people had a grasp of the sciences. Whereas these days, it's pretty much common knowledge. I mean, we all have other things to do, so we don't spend much time on it. But a basic familiarity with sort of the various fields of science and some of the central theories, I think, is very common. And I think in the future, especially if we keep going the way we have been going in terms of robotics and AI and that kind of thing, there will be increasingly more free time for human beings. So I think that what you're talking about in terms of the careerism and the kind of incentives that exist to carve out a position and stick to it like glue, that's still going to go on, but there's going to be 100 or 1,000 times as many people dabbling, which I think really opens up the field for innovative advancements in these fields that don't feel, where people don't feel. I think a lot of what makes people stick to a position is feeling like their colleagues won't respect them, if they go too far in this sort of metaphysical direction. Whereas the average person, honestly, is like, I'm just going where my sense making leads me. I don't have colleagues, I just want to know what's right. So
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that previously, perhaps in the last 100 years, the universities have been gatekeeping knowledge and kind of, oh, well, we're only going to fund you if it's explicitly
exactly
following these particular parameters and assumptions. But YouTube has democratized the space for exploration and expressions of different theories. But also the internet has made it a bit of a cesspool. Any old person can claim any old shit, and people can gain a following, and that can be like, oh yeah, we believe in
yeah.
whatever it is, and there's a kind of meaninglessness or a loss of learning how to learn when all knowledge is available, but none of it is,
Yeah.
teaching us how to be discerning.
Yeah, it's a strange sort of paradoxical effect. I'm very intrigued by that, actually. That in the age where, there's never been a time when we've had such access to knowledge and information, and but it seems like a lot of the time what you observe is that wealth of information becomes a vast resource that most people choose to abuse more than to utilize. And there's a sense where there's a lack of quality control in the ideas that are propagated, and like you're saying, anyone can sort of garner a following. But I think that discernment, although it's a rare quality, is had by a fair proportion of the intellectual population. And I think people who are discerning tend to gravitate towards people who really do make sense. I think a lot of the time, the kind of following that is gathered up by people who, let's say, are running a bit of a confidence game, on people, is people who don't have the time to do the thinking themselves. And the more time people have, the less satisfactory I think some of that charlatan behavior is going to be to people.
Yeah, no, I hope so. And there's probably stages of development in terms of learning, where people are more interested in particular kinds of personalities, and then without thinking, and then being more discerning comes a bit later. But I'd love to come back a little bit to the materialism essay, because one of another possible framing for a physicalist to maintain their position and kind of reject any kind of metaphysics would be that yes, we don't know exactly what the ground of being is, but at some point in the future, we will have a physical explanation for it. That's one framing of it, that we can just defer the responsibility of providing an answer to some physical answer in the future that we haven't got yet. Another one might be something that I see in certain physicalist models where they just point to something specifically unknown, like the singularity, like, oh, our models break down there and we can't explore it with our physical tools, but that's what we have. Like, we just have to end the search there because we can't actually probe it with our empiricism. So yeah, well, how do you respond to those kind of positions?
I guess I'm optimistic about the prospect of potentially coming up with a more tractable description of things like a singularity. I don't think it's intellectually satisfying, at least to me, but I suspect to other people as well, to say, well, this thing is sort of the limit of what can be understood and we can go no further. That seems to me like a dubious assertion. I mean, after all, if it's the limit of understanding, how do you know it's the limit of understanding? I mean, it kind of seems like I've always thought it kind of amounts to saying, well, I can't figure it out, and nobody I know can figure it out. Ergo, it can't be figured out, and that seems pessimistic in the extreme. There's all sorts of things historically that have had that character, and time again, humanity has managed to overstep those boundaries and to discover new vistas of meaning and lucidity in our relationship to the nature of the phenomena of the world. What was the first?
That we can defer our
Yeah,
answer.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that the nature of physical principles is inherent. It's inherent in a physical principle that it could be other than it is. So from my perspective, if there were a quote unquote physical explanation that did not appeal to, okay, we get down far enough and this is just a fact of reality. There's no explanation. It's just a brute fact. That's how I imagine physical models ultimately grounding out, is in brute facts, which are just claimed to be true, even though in principle they could be otherwise. The idea is that just in practice, this is just the way the world is. And that's not a full explanation. Like, it's just not. And to the extent that a physical model incorporates things that couldn't be otherwise as a way of explaining or contextualizing those otherwise conceivably brute facts, I would argue it's already started to verge onto metaphysics or to go directly into metaphysics. And, at that point, I just don't know what it means to say, well, in the future, there'll be this physical explanation. I'm assuming the idea is purely physical, but that wouldn't at that point be purely physical. It would be physical up to a point and then metaphysical. And I guess the thought would be that, now that we've filled in the whole picture of physics, and this is kind of what I was saying before, it kind of warrants that turn towards metaphysics that makes for a complete explanation. But you couldn't then turn back and say, so this is all physical, this is a purely physical explanation. That would just, I think, be silly.
Right. There's a sense of moving the goalposts, but there is some newer theories, physicalist theories, which posit that space-time, for example, is emergent, comes out of something more primary. But then you think, well, if extension, space and time, is not physical, matter isn't physical, why are we calling it physicalism?
Exactly. And there, I think the term suffers from a similar limitation, I suppose, as to what we might see with the term nature. However, I'm much more comfortable with the term nature than the term physical. And it does seem like a moving of the goalposts. And that's part of what I was talking about in the essay is, we routinely redefine what physical means, but because of the meaning, the etymological root of the sort of term physical, I feel like there's got to be a stopping point to that. Whereas part of what I think makes nature apt to be constantly redefined to include everything is that part of what, like a secondary meaning and secondary, primary, who knows, but another meaning of nature is the what something is, right? So it doesn't just mean I guess the way the world is, but you can also talk about like the nature of, say, an atom, the nature of an electron. So in a sense, this word refers to and in some sense words start to break down, what something is, the nature. Yeah, I can't think of a good synonym that fits better in that sense. And so I guess yeah, I see that as pointing towards the inherent vagueness of this notion of the physical, which especially in the last sort of 200 years has undergone serious revision to the point where, I mean, once upon a time, what we meant by sort of a physical material object is I can, my body doesn't go through it and it's solid and I can see it and so on and so forth. And nowadays, what we mean by physical is something much more abstract, and it's identifiable essentially with things that are responsive to certain equations. And I think that's fine to have redefined it that way, but I think it's needful to recognize that something about that process means that it's difficult. It's like a slippery concept. It's very difficult to get a grip on just what it is that we're talking about.
Right. I'd love to also bring in the kind of maybe third and final issue with materialism that you bring up in your essay, which is consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. How would you outline that as an issue of materialism?
Yeah, I guess the way I think about the hard problem of consciousness is that it's very difficult to understand from a physical description of the way that interactions between things composed of matter occur. It's very difficult to understand why there should be an inner dimension, what it is like to be a human being, or the famous example is a bat or an ant or anything with subjectivity. It kind of seems as if for most of our models in the natural sciences, you can get by without ever talking about interiority and experience. The mechanics don't seem to call for it, and it's very difficult to understand how a world that can be fleshed out entirely in talk of mechanics comes to have this kind of interiority, which is the very substance of what it is to exist for a creature like you and I, is to experience the world, is to have this point of reference and to process the world and to know the difference between what's out there and what's in here. And one of the things that I say in the article is, and this is a bit of a caricature, but I think there's something to it, which is it's very hard to imagine how a million billiard balls in intricate formation could ever give rise to this experience of what it is like to be. It's very easy to see how a description like that accounts for the way things are and the way they interact and the, sort of the complexities that arise. But one complexity that doesn't seem to fit neatly anywhere in the scheme, no matter how sophisticated it gets, is, why should there be an inner dimension to anything?
Right. So physicalism, there are various different attempts at explaining that. There's kind of a full reductionism, like it's all just brain activity, like anything that is perceived as anything like an inner experience is just reducible to neurons firing and chemicals and physiological activity, then there's a kind of similar but different emergentism. Like there's a sense that the brain and its structures brings about some new property, which we call consciousness, that is not reducible to neurons firing, but the fact of neurons firing and the things that are happening in the brain somehow give rise to this extra new conditional property that we call consciousness. Do you feel like either of those holds a good explanation?
Yeah, I mean, the first one amounts ultimately to a suggestion that consciousness is not actually real, some kind of illusion or a mere epiphenomenon. It doesn't actually have any role. It doesn't play a role in, which is, I think, runs very counter to our actual experience of what it is like. It very much seems as if, as living beings, a lot of our decision making and behavior seems to ultimately come down to qualities of experience, and then to say, well, this is just a kind of added and unnecessary dimension that doesn't do or achieve anything. I mean, even on evolution, that just does not seem like a very plausible hypothesis. Like it's expensive to run this sort of internal simulation, and it's not doing anything. Why the hell are we doing it? The second option, I think, is much more plausible. However, even that seems to run into certain limitations. Like, I think, and that the second option of emergence is what for most of my life I've tended towards. But that seems to me to be fit primarily to explain the kind of consciousness that we have. So, sort of self-referential, a self-consciousness, an awareness of the fact that we're conscious, and the employment of language in describing to ourselves what is happening, and so on and so forth.
Metacognition in a language.
Exactly. And so sort of capacities of consciousness that distinguish it, say, from just mere consciousness or something like that. That explanation, although I wouldn't rule out that there might be an explanation along those lines in terms of how consciousness gets here to begin with, it certainly is far from obvious. I feel like we've got, over the past sort of 50 years, we've got a significantly more sophisticated picture of how brains and consciousness are related to one another, and what kinds of processes are involved in generating conscious experience, what brain structures are involved. And none of it's got us at all closer, in my opinion, to actually giving an account of, okay, this is where consciousness itself, awareness, enters into the equation. This is how it's generated. It seems like at most what we've done is explained how higher faculties that presuppose consciousness come online. And so I guess, although I am partial to an emergentist approach, it seems to me that it's not obvious on the face of it that kind of approach is equipped to give a complete explanation of consciousness.
Right. So there's almost like you're saying that there's a truth to emergentism in that yes, there are these levels of structure that and complexity that give rise to new properties not found in the previous levels of structure and complexity. But you can't explain those new properties via the pieces of, or the parts of the structure itself. Like it's still not reducible to atoms or to billiard balls. So
exactly, yeah.
Does that then for you, like, what's your position on, say, determinism versus free will?
I think that's a very vexing debate.
Maybe we don't go into that now because we've got plenty to cover.
Well, I'll just give a brief sketch. I mean, I think if free will means the ability to choose such that you could have chosen otherwise, which I think is the the singularly dominant definition employed throughout all the literature, then I think it's not real. Determinism in that sense is true. Things that happen are determined by prior causes and reasons. But my thought is that because a determinism seems obvious, and free will is incompatible, and free will under that definition is incompatible, and yet human beings care about and believe in something that we call free will. My thought is that free will must mean something different to the way it has been historically understood by philosophers.
Yeah, I like that one as well. It's like, how do we, because free will and the common definition almost feels like a godliness of some kind. Like, how does one break free of the causal chain? But if we posit that the experiential self is part of that causal chain, then in some sense there's some piece of us as part of choosing, not that it's free from causes, but it's just a part of it. That would be kind of redefine free will as maybe something more relative, or like the capacity to take a moment and take stock and think and therefore have some separation from an immediate kind of reactionary response to something. That
I think that's definitely along the right lines. I think part of the meaning comes from this participatory notion you mentioned, where we're not just a link in the chain, but we play an active role in determining the future outcomes. I do think it's got something to do with the capacity of reflection on our automatic nature, and a kind of the ability to imagine a new way of being, something like that.
Mm. And again, these kind of concepts will have problems depending on if you're a hard determinist or if you believe in emergentism and how you frame it and all this kind of stuff. But I guess the coming now to your idealism essay, because the hard problem of consciousness is often the thing cited as the issue with materialism that allows for something like idealism to come into the picture. And you kind of explore two different ways of thinking about idealism: the kind of epistemological idealism, as in like all we can know is our experience, therefore it makes sense to kind of take that a step further to someone, which might either look like solipsism or it might look like idealism. Right, I can kind of have these different flavors. But I'd love to hear your explanation of the kind of thinking that leads one to posit idealism.
Yeah. I think that most of the time, I think you're right. It is this sort of awareness of the hard problem of consciousness that leads people to endorse idealism. And I think usually the idea is, well, idealism and materialism are set up as opposites. And if one of them has obvious problems, then I think the thought is that it lends credibility to the opposite.
As if they're the only options or something.
Exactly.
Like that.
Yeah. As if they're the only options. But I'm not convinced, and I've never seen sort of persuasive evidence that idealism does a better job actually in explaining how come there's an interiority of experience. It has always seemed to me that idealism, rather than solving the hard problem of consciousness, makes it to disappear by sort of saying, well, consciousness just is the nature of reality, and so if consciousness is sort of fundamental to the nature of reality, then the question of, well, how does consciousness arise is a non-question. There's no arise in it. There's no need for it to arise if everything's made out of consciousness, right? But that just seems to me to make the problem significantly more acute, in that I don't feel that I'm given any more of a grasp on like the nature of consciousness and sort of how it comes to be, how it works. And what's worse is that thing that I don't understand at all is then positioned as kind of the pivotal construct in an entire scheme of imagining reality. That and the thought, I think, of idealists is, well, this dramatically simplifies things, and it explains and gives a, provides a context in which you can fit all your observations. And I just find myself wondering, well, first of all, a lot of our observations seem to point in the opposite direction. They kind of point towards the primacy of something like matter over consciousness, but also at the point where consciousness is pivotal, I start to feel like I can't conceptualize what's being discussed anymore. Like I'm not able to achieve a lucid picture in my puny little human mind about, what I just don't know what we were talking about anymore. What even is
Yeah.
consciousness? What is mind at that point?
Right. There's a sense that we have the hard problem of consciousness in materialism as kind of unexplained interiority. And that for a lot of idealists, they just kind of pull that out of materialism and just draw a circle around materialism and be like, oh, this is what this is. This is what all this stuff we call material reality is this thing that, but without explaining it, it's just more descriptions almost, like we're
Yeah,
just giving a place for the problem to lie, which is now
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
harder to access and also allows for a lot more nonsense to creep in.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that's a good description of it. And I in the essay suggest that it magnifies the problem unbearably. And I think that's a good way of describing it, because magnifying it, that is what it does. It writes that problem over the whole universe, like rather than just being a sort of a problem for creatures like us who actually are conscious. If everything is consciousness, then the problem of what is the nature of consciousness, it becomes much more acute. And I definitely agree that that kind of explanation opens the door to all kinds of nonsense and frippery. But I also think that's part of what draws people to it. And there's some merit to that, in that people who are disillusioned with the rigid constraints imposed by a reductive scientism, say, see idealism as giving intellectual license to a set of ideas that they feel have truth to them, but are very difficult to contextualize in a way that gives them credibility in the kind of reductive scientific physicalist paradigms.
Right. Yeah, there's a sense that that modernism brought with it rationality in science and kind of this empiricism, and that there's this postmodern movement and even metamodern movement where these materialism and empiricism truths are being questioned, but also there's this pre-modern existence of kind of in the new age and in different communities which feel justified by this postmodern modern exploration of those.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I have a piece actually called "The Word" on Medium, which is about the magic of language. And one of the things that I observe in that piece is that uh, never before have we lived in an age where our way of understanding the world has had such unprecedented success that it's possible to completely forget that it's just a way of talking about things, that and that it's not the thing itself. And like that distinction between the map and the territory in modernity, it's like it works so well that the need to make that distinction almost falls away, and people become bewitched by the thought that reality is nothing but what science tells us. And the thing about science is it's provisional, it's always being updated. And someone who can't extricate themselves from this sort of circle, this binding magical circle of a certain way of looking at the world and thinking and speaking about it, can't do that imaginative work of visualizing uh, ways that the world could be that aren't given an immediate license by that paradigm, and trying to understand how could these things both be true? How could this fit together? How could this one world contain all these apparently contradictory truths? There's a kind of narrow-mindedness that's much more prevalent in modernity than ever in history, because historically we've had sort of understandings of the nature of the world and its workings, but they've never been so successful. Like the scientific advancement has led to the kind of technological innovations that work so well, that it's possible to completely forget that the world might be different to what we think it is.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like there's a sense that, coming out of the religious dark ages, where there's rejection and rebellion against religious doctrine, and especially the kind of attitude that religion has had throughout history against thinking individuals. But then science itself has had a kind of almost religious renaissance in its standardization of how it presents and how people have to present their knowledge in these academic ways, which again is kind of limiting and creating new dogmatic ways of thinking about things. So it's almost like we need a new scientific paradigm shift in order to shake up these rigid ways of thinking, and especially I think that's the case in education. Like obviously we have YouTube and places where we can talk freely, but nobody cites a YouTube personality in their academic papers, right? Like it's all academia citing more academia, and there's a secularity to the kind of knowledge that gets propagated through new generations.
Yeah, I think no one cites a YouTube personality yet.
Yeah.
I think paper credentials, I think, quickly becoming worth less and less. And the age of the autodidact, I think, is swiftly approaching an age where you don't need or want an institution to put their stamp on you, as a stamp of approval. I think that's always going to help with credibility, but it seems to me that part of what the intellectual community needs is people who, it's not just not being afraid to think outside the box, but I've always thought, and this is part of how I guess conceptualize my own intellectual development, is that there's a kind of merit to coming to the table without with as clean as possible a tabula rasa, in your brain. I feel, especially in questions of philosophy, and this is something I touch on in my article on True Philosophy, where I talk about living philosophy and dead philosophy, but there's this tendency to internalize all the various ways that humans have approached a problem historically, and when asked to give an opinion on it, to pick the one you like the best, which is, there's something stagnant and really not, repetitive, stagnant, dead. There's something about that that's not a fit for purpose when it comes to moving things forward. And there's something about not knowing anything that positions you optimally to innovate in a way that when you then learn about the various approaches that people have historically taken to the problem, you can then supplement your fresh insights with their methodological sophistication, and that can create something new and potentially paradigm shifting.
Right. Yeah. I think what you're touching on is a criticism I've had for kind of cults and people who tend to follow a guru or someone who's clearly got like a lot of wisdom and knowledge, but they've gained that wisdom and knowledge and they're maybe presenting a new system through years of study and through years of their own exploration. And then the crowd that gathers around that individual they're only hearing the kind of end product of that journey. and they're quite often just sort of unthinkingly repeating almost the rhetoric. They get this language, this rhetoric, without having to do the work of actually exploring the foundations of where that rhetoric came from. And then they're just propagating this rhetoric without really understanding why it's true or why it makes sense. And maybe it has merit in its kind of capacity to provide transformation, especially in terms of like spiritual gurus. Like there's legitimate experiences that people have that, are transformative. But the kind of discernment is missing.
Yeah.
And even in sense of the postmodernity, there's this, all truths are partially true, or like there's this desire to, which I think is a great thing, like the kind of comparative religious projects or comparative whatever, insert whatever here, it is really good for learning about different information. But then there's a discernment piece, and I think what you rightly pointed out is like a methodological piece as well. Like, how did these people come to their conclusions? And it's kind of like, again, it's like learning how to learn, and learning how to do the work of putting information, seemingly disparate information, together to make something make sense. And that's not a skill that many people are teaching, I don't think.
Well, I think that's the kind of skill you can only get from that guru if you are a direct student, rather than a hanger-on or someone who consumes the content, so to speak. Or I think that it's much more laborious to teach the how than the what. The what can be assimilated quick. The how is like a painful process that often requires years and many mistakes. And the job of the teacher in that respect is to kind of help the student forge their own path. But unless there's that personal relationship where you start to realize, hey, this is just a human being, this is not some kind of someone over and above me. This is a teacher, my teacher, but he's just a human being, and he could be wrong, and I've seen him be wrong, and my job, and I think this is, can't remember the exact quote, but it's kind of, the duty of the student is to surpass the master,
Yeah, 100%. I feel like maybe it's a super interesting conversation, but I'd love to bring it back to idealism and that kind of thing. And I think the kind of thread that we've been following to where we just got to was this tendency for people to jump on idealism, one for it fits their kind of new age beliefs in a better way. It's kind of reactionary to scientific materialism. And two, it apparently makes better sense of the world than materialism does. And I think maybe analytic idealism is a good example of, like, Bernardo Kastrup is clearly like a very intelligent person and well-read, and has all of these specific ways that he determines his analytic idealism. But the majority of people who, at least, in the communities that I've been a part of, who present his work, just, again, it just feels like surface level rhetoric without that true understanding. It's kind of, I can say the same things as him because I know the rhetoric, like, it's more parsimonious, or it's, hard materialism doesn't answer this, and as if that's justifying it.
Yeah, and I think the parsimonious one, I think that gets a lot of people. I don't think it is actually more parsimonious. I think there's a kind of sleight of hand going on there that I kind of point towards in the final thoughts section of my essay. Part of why it appears parsimonious is that it's epistemologically conservative, or it tries to be. It sort of says, well, all we ever know is experience, and we can describe the contents of experience by referring to them as contents of experience, and we don't lose anything. We can make all the same predictions and so on if we describe it that way. And there's a feeling of, we don't want to go beyond that to posit unobservables. We just want to stick with what we directly have access to, that is the contents of experience. But the thing about idealism as a metaphysical hypothesis, which is that's what the vast majority of idealists are, is in the end they think that the nature of reality itself is consciousness. They don't. There's a kind of sleight of hand going on where they kind of say, well, all we can ever know is experience. Therefore, reality itself must just be experience. And it seems to me that the moment you make that step, there's nothing epistemologically conservative about that step at all. That seems to me stock standard, what any kind of materialist or scientific paradigm does in assuming that things like electrons or fields or forces, these things really exist. You can't at one and the same time say, well, I'm not willing to admit the real existence of these things because they're not really observable, and I'm being epistemologically conservative and I'm just staying within the boundaries of what can strictly be known, and then to go, and then reality itself is conscious. It's like, you can't have it both ways. You have to pick a lane, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a sense that there's still, like, even if you posit consciousness first, you still have the problem of kind of infinite regression in terms of explanation of material things. Like, you could just make a clear distinction of, like, it goes what we know in quantum mechanics, and then consciousness is the thing that we don't understand. I'm just going to put that there. That's not an explanation because it doesn't give us any real mechanics of how anything emerges out of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
How does mathematics arise out of consciousness? Does that mean consciousness is a mathematical entity? Like, what? Like, it doesn't. Most often, there is no particulars to consciousness that allow for our particular reality to pop out of it. And in that sense, it's less parsimonious because I guess with parsimony, there's the official definition where it's all things being equal, the one with less presuppositions is more likely true. But then we have to think, are these equal? Like, are they on equal footing?
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I think, and I think that's a clause or a qualifier that is frequently neglected by an idealist. They make the assumption that these things are equal, when in reality, the explanatory sufficiency of a realist framework about mind-independent objects is far superior. The realist supposition seems to go with the grain of evidence that we can observe, whereas I think the idealist supposition actually goes against the grain of evidence. You know, we have a fairly sophisticated picture of the history of the cosmos and the history of the Earth, and it seems like things existed before things like us. It seems like fossils are in the ground before we dig them up. They don't start being there because we become conscious of them, and, more broadly, to the extent, the thing about sort of a metaphysical debate like idealism versus realism is that depending on which of the two you presuppose, all of the evidence can be made to fit either one, But so my thought is always, what independent reasons can be given to motivate a belief in one or the other? And my feeling is that realism seems to be a commitment entailed by our best theories. Of course, there's some room for quibbling on that in terms of quantum physics, and I think this is one area where a lot of intelligent people do feel that consciousness must be somehow essential to the fabric of reality. That, however, is not quite the same as idealism. You could be a panpsychist and have a view that consciousness and matter are coextensive, that, one-to-one everywhere that there's matter, there's consciousness, everywhere that there's consciousness, there's matter. You can have a view like that. Idealism is a queerer, more abstruse view about consciousness itself alone being the foundation of everything that exists. And when you're making a hypothesis like that, it just seems to me, first of all, it's obvious that there has to be something, that is sort of a non-contingent ground, transcendental ground of being. But at the point where you're calling it consciousness, and this is partly an angle I explore in the essay, and I think it is, in fact, one of the strongest arguments against idealism is consciousness means things like us, things that are responsive and move around. And I mean, the reference of the term consciousness comes from concrete examples of life forms, basically. We typically think rocks are not conscious, trees, at the very least, are not very conscious, the lower animals, insects, and so on, also not very, more conscious than a tree, but not very conscious at all, and sort of up and up it goes until we get to creatures like us. And in all of those things that we're calling consciousness inheres in simpler, in a complex made up of simpler constituents. It's embodied in some way. And when we're talking about consciousness as the foundation of reality, that notion of being inhering in or being embodied in parts that are simpler, that's a non-starter. And so at the point where that's a non-starter, I start to wonder, consciousness at that point seems, whatever primal or primary consciousness it is totally different from everything we mean when we employ the term. And at that point, I start to wonder, why are we even using that term? That seems misleading, and I don't know what could possibly warrant that identification.
Right. Yeah, there's a sense that, there's a few things there. That there's a sense that consciousness as a experience of human being experience is a lot more complicated than other animals' consciousness or experience. And that if we posit that the mind at large consciousness is more simple, again, like some kind of most simple version of consciousness, then it begs the question of how all this detail emerges within it. Like where does our version of consciousness live in the most simplest version of consciousness, almost backwards in that sense. But then, or you could posit that consciousness is more like our consciousness, and then you've got more religious ideals or spiritual ideas of like, a human being is in some way an embodiment of that consciousness. Like, I think, again, analytic idealism talks about the disassociative boundaries, and that a human mind is a kind of like a disassociative part of a bigger mind, and you can kind of consider that the whole universe together is that mind, or something like that. There's, I guess, the simple version of consciousness seems less congruent in some way, but where would you put this kind of mind at large being kind of the whole universe together, and that in some sense that all of that stuff in a physical sense creates with all of the interiorities of all of those things, creates like a new mind that is the kind of mind at large?
So that strikes me as some emergent phenomenon, which I think is contra the hypothesis of idealism. I'm not against the idea. First, so if I had to categorize that species of thought, I would call that a kind of panpsychism. And it seems plausible to me that on a panpsychist world, there could be higher and higher levels of mind, as you reach bigger and bigger complex organizations of things. And I'm open to a view like that. But that seems to run contrary to the current of idealistic thought, which is that rather than the aggregate constituting a consciousness, the idea is that consciousness constitutes an aggregate. And the thing I find very confusing about that is consciousness, if we're talking about something like this idea of a simple, like the most simple quote unquote mind possible, I start to wonder, what characteristics does it have that make it identifiable as a mind? like I'm on board with the idea that there's some most simple thing, that kind of contains and contextualizes everything else. But the idealist hypothesis is that that is aptly described as mind or consciousness or experience. And I, first of all, I don't really know what that means. And second of all, it's not obvious how that's explanatory how that does explanatory work in helping us to understand what we can observe. One of the puzzles that I often come up against when I'm thinking about this is, okay, putting aside the issue that mind just is not a simple, at least as far as we have any experience with what mind means. It's just not a simple phenomenon. It's always based on simpler parts. That there's no mind that we've ever observed that is a simple. But putting that aside, why is it that this is the world that exists rather than any other? What is it about this world that's so special to that primordial or mind at large? And yeah, why should there be anything as an interior world? Why isn't the mind just chilling? Or I don't know. It just seems, I just don't quite, it's not clear to me how that helps to contextualize our empirical observations. It just seems like a way of, obviously it could be that what we call the external world, the exteriority of our experience, the things that aren't within our quote unquote dissociated minds, is really the interiority of a mind at large, just like we could be in a matrix, or we could be, conjured up by some malevolent god, striving to deceive us about absolutely everything. There's all sorts of metaphysical hypotheses that could be true. And if they were true, then we would not know different, right? Because all of the evidence is ultimately compatible with whichever one we presuppose. But I put idealism on a similar level as the Matrix or Descartes' demon, in that there's no way to rule it out. But what reason do we have to think it's actually true? Because the usual thought with things like the Matrix and Descartes' demon is that in the absence of some independent reasons that motivate the thought that this is actually true, it's sort of an epistemic possibility. We can't tell against it, but we're not going to act like it's true. Yeah, it doesn't seem like the fact that it's possible and that if it were true, everything would be compatible with that. Like, all the evidence would get recontextualized to fit that hypothesis. That in itself doesn't give us any good reason to think it is in fact true.
Right. It's almost like it's more just a preference. Like I'm reminded of some Christians who are like, well, I'm going to behave, or kind of doubtful Christians. It's like, I'm going to behave as if Christianity is true, because if it is true, then I want to go to heaven and not go to hell. And it's
like
almost, yes,
wager.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a sense that with committing to an idealism, you're either, I don't want to do the work of, inquiry and skepticism around this position, perhaps because it, just fits nicely with my already existing ideas about the world. Or maybe it's just lazy. Maybe it's more of a psychological thing.
Yeah, I think there are psychological reasons that compel one towards it. First of all, I think, like I was saying before, it opens one up to a huge swath of ideas, some of which I think are legitimate. And so there's a truth-seeking instinct in human beings that is capable of pinging, there's some truth to this, even if the rational mind can't make sense of what it is. So when things like that are getting excluded, human beings are looking for a framework that's going to be capable of including it. But I also think, part of it is that, I guess a kind of anthropomorphic strain, in the sense of, I'm conscious, and if the world is conscious, then that it's like I'm close to the heart of things. I'm important. I'm of the sort of thing that everything ultimately is. There's something comforting about identifying the ultimate nature of reality as something that is strictly the same as what you are. There's something about that appeals to human sensibilities, and also it gives us, for example, like, oh, if existence is consciousness, then it completely assuages death anxiety, right? When I die, I, rather than sort of vanishing into inert matter, machinations of matter, where I'm absorbed back into this larger whole, which I was always just a manifestation of, and that is me, and I am that, and there's no fundamental difference between what I am now and what I will be then, except the scope. And so I think there's a few different reasons that make it a very attractive hypothesis, but I would offer that most of those reasons don't stand up to epistemological scrutiny. There's all sorts of things that are sort of congenial to human temperament to believe that turn out not to be true. And in the vast majority of cases, we train ourselves out of identifications that just turn out not to be true, you know?
There's also some sense that there's a history, like the whole history of humanity has been filled with imagery and myth and stories of something like a mind at large, whether that's God or something
Yes.
else, something bigger than ourselves, something big, more than the matter that we perceive. So there's definitely a proclivity to, within human beings, almost like as an evolutionary story element to our psyches,
Yeah.
that makes sense. It makes sense that we would move towards idealism,
Yeah.
and reject materialism in some way.
Yeah, it's like a return to and a recovery of a forgotten ancient truth to many modern people, you know. Modernity has successfully disillusioned them of a sort of more primitive notion of a creator god, and mind at large is like a updated, or seemingly, a more intellectually credible iteration of pretty much the same belief.
Mm. And it's secular. Like we
Mhm.
don't have to put any particular face on mind at large. It's a sort of abstract notion that is, like you said, relatable
Well,
because we have that.
yeah, we don't have to put any particular face on it, and we can put whatever face we like in
Yeah,
our own
yeah,
sort of telling of things.
yeah, yeah. So I'm curious to know, with that in mind, like with that sense that there's a something in us as human beings that has this story, has this image, has this, like, it's in psychedelic experiences and spiritual traditions. It's sort of prevalent throughout the human culture, regardless of where they exist. I'm curious, that for me, that's very telling. Like, I wouldn't brush that off lightly, like materialism tends to do, and be like, oh, it's all just, I don't know, it's all just something that is explained by atoms. And idealism, I think, is a attempt at pointing to what that is, and the kind of mindedness of it, the kind of experiential aspect of it is needed. It's kind of like that. How do we capture that without idealism?
Yeah,
Because materialism doesn't have the answer. It's got the hard problem of consciousness, and then if we don't have idealism, what do we have? How do we explain interiority?
yeah. I mean, I don't claim to have the solutions to the problem of. I think consciousness is the only thing on a par with the mysteriousness of consciousness is existence itself. Like consciousness is the most complex thing we've ever encountered. I don't think we'll ever encounter anything more complex than consciousness. As to alternative options, I think panpsychism is quite a natural choice to attenuate the hardness of the problem to some degree. It's not a complete solution, but it does seem like a partial solution. And in terms of not, let's say, turning our nose up at the intuitive. As I was saying, human beings have a pinging for, this. There's something true about this. But when I think of something like a god, my thought is that people have the wrong idea about God, in that they put him at the bottom of things, and this is actually something I talk about a little bit in the discussion section of DM theory. Is what is the proper place for God? Is it the ground, or is it the pinnacle? The peak, the very top of the mountain of existence and truth and complexity. And I think it's more fitting and more sensible intuitively to place him at the peak. Consciousness seems to me to be a very high up the mountain, and not the reason that things are. Instead, like in some sense, the end point, the highest they can go, and more sophisticated forms of consciousness, and that sort of, I think, goes towards what you were saying before about very complex organizations having that sort of conscious dimension to them. And so when I think of God, when I'm thinking of a version of God that I could potentially believe in, I think of something like a sort of a transcendental object at the end of time. Like consciousness has this evolutionary rising up out of darkness, that we're a part of that process. And I think it's plausible that in the future, especially with the integration of more and more sophisticated technology, that there'll be a kind of convergence of individual perspectives into some kind of hive mind consciousness that human beings have, that that there's a chance of a continual upward assimilation until there's some kind of like end result of that, which is like the whole universe being sort of self-aware and including in it. And my thought, I guess, is that on some level that's already happened and happening and going on, and that in a sense that transcends time. The there levels of consciousness, that being the cosmos itself and solar systems and all of that, there could be dimensions of consciousness that include us as aspects, that draw on us, that we don't have the sophistication to be aware of, in much the same way that we in our bodies have sort of gut microbiome, and those sort of microorganisms are just doing their thing and probably not aware that they're part of a larger being, us, that's making use of them. They're a part of us, but they're also just their own thing. They're just chugging along, doing what microorganisms do. I kind of think of us as a similar way as, except, of course, that rather than just being just what we are, we're part of this gradual ascent of consciousness into an apotheosis of self-awareness and transcendence.
Yeah, really interesting. So I guess a question I have around that is, if we're positing a kind of outside of time God, as you put it, that is somehow like everything inside of time and space is all right, I'll start again. If we're positing something outside of time that is God, then it seems to be that the things that are inside of time, like the matter in us, is a part of that God. But then if it's outside of time, then it's both the beginning and the end, right? Like it's not the start. It's not there at the start, because it's not part of that whole process.
At the start, but it's not the beginning, because the beginning implies the thing that gets things going. Whereas I would think of it as standing over and above time. And so it's conceivable as the end, in the sense that everything that happens in time contributes towards it having the structure that it does, but it always has that structure. I guess I think of it as like a timeline, and then this is like maybe an emergent property, or that this kind of conscious awareness, is like a hovering above the whole timeline, I guess, would be one way of picturing it mentally. But the usual notion of beginning is the thing that pushes that first domino. And I don't think that that's a role that God plays exactly, I guess.
Right. But there's still, even with that analogy, there's still this sense of like a place where this timeline exists, which I think doesn't make sense if space and time aren't
Yeah,
part
I think
of
place
that
is
domain.
just the best. We don't have any better terminology.
Yeah,
I wouldn't know how to talk about it if I wasn't able to talk about place.
sure. Okay, but even so, there's like, we've got this dimensionless point, say, that it contains the whole history of the universe, and that God is in some sense you might say the emergent property of that point. It sort of stands over and above that point in some, but it's also inherently that point as well. And there's no sense of time for the point because it's zero dimensions. Then it must exist at all times while that point
Yeah,
exists.
exists from the beginning, but it's not the beginning itself. That's
Yes,
kind of
it's not the ground of being. It's just part of the ground of being.
yeah, yeah. In the same way as, like the sort of the Big Bang is not the ground of being, but it's always a part of and the end point of our universe. The thing I think that the reason I push back more against the description of beginning and end, and I push back on the beginning part, is that uh, I think of it as the end in the sense of it's kind of what everything is for. There's a kind of purposefulness where everything that is, all the different life forms, all the different experiences and perspectives, all contribute to and combine together to create this transcendental object. And that's a sense in which, it is an end, but it's not, end in that sense has multiple meanings, whereas beginning has a much more strictly temporal notion to it.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting image. And I think maybe we can have more discussions about your theories specifically around that another time.
Well, yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not necessarily committed to that description. That's just a version of God that I could be open to. So in the sense of, answering your question as, I, if we are not going to turn our nose up at I guess the fact that this is a recurring theme in human thought, humans believe in this, and this seems important to us, and that's a way of accommodating that, I think,
Got it. Yeah.
without compromising on what I consider to be important to making sense of the world.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And you mentioned before that as well that there's still this problem of interiority that you're open to
Yeah,
trying to find a version of that as well. And I guess there's a conversation at some point we can have around where those two things you've described meet. Like where does interiority meet God, or where does at what point does your model because it almost sounds like an idealism in some sense. Not that it's an idealism fully, but it's got this kind of flavor of it of with God being both outside of time and kind of it's not the creator of the material, but it's sort of like inherently part of it in some way. Maybe more like a
yeah,
panpsychism, but
yeah. I think it's more of a panpsychism, and I think the way that I would distinguish them is that ground peak analogy I used. Idealism I see as being this notion that consciousness is fundamental to, and the fundament, that's the foundation, the ground, the bottom, the thing on which everything else is built.
right.
And my perspective is that, rather than consciousness being the thing on which everything is built, that on which everything stands, instead it's the thing that everything builds towards, the thing that stands atop everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, my personal metaphysics is similar, where there's a kind of potential space that is, but it's not that all of our universe's time and space exists. It's more of a process of unfolding, but it's still this cycle. It's still a kind of starting with the ultimate individuation of all things, where there's no God or there's no mind as such. But although I do kind of like to reframe mind in particular ways, but at least in terms of the common parlance of mind, that doesn't exist. But then there's a cycle of evolution, and God is the outcome of that, but also the beginning in the sense that it's a cycle. So sort of at the end peak, there's where everything is undifferentiated, then there's another differentiation, and that's kind of the cyclical Big Bang
Yeah.
system.
I mean, that reminds me of and this is more of a mythopoetic sort of notion, but an idea around the entire universe being, this still has that same sense of it's not the ground, but instead it's more like a recurring. In that sense, it would be a beginning point, but not a beginning of existence, more a beginning of particularity or something like that. But a sleeping God who's dreaming up a world like this, and the end result of the dream is to wake up, is to the consciousness to evolve to the point where it wakes up, and then he wakes up, and then he's like, "That was a cool dream. I'm gonna go back to sleep." You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
Yeah,
um,
no, I kind of like that framing.
yeah. Maybe next time, if you, I'm hoping that you continue to write your articles on Medium and Substack. Maybe we could do one of these, where I interview you about some of your articles. I think that would be
Sure. Yeah,
really,
yeah.
you know, a good compliment to what we've done today.
No, I'd like that too. Yeah, it's always fun to kind of get you to probe and me to have to think out loud, because it's one thing writing stuff, like I can take my time and find resources and whatever, and then thinking out loud is relatively a bit of a new project for me, like
Yeah.
doing interviews and stuff about this thing. So cool. Yeah, I feel like we've covered most of my questions about idealism. Yeah, we talked about the lack of what you like to call the derivation of specificity in idealism. Yeah, the kind of way that idealism likes to just draw a circle around materialism and kind of extract the hard problem and just put it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Put it everywhere.
Put it everywhere. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've talked about the risks of idealism in terms of smuggling in kind of nonsense, whether it's non-explanation. Yeah, we've talked about the fact that, you know, the interiority is still an unknown. Like we still need to work that thing out and maybe do it a bit more rigorously. Yeah, I guess maybe a question I like to have a couple of questions here. So, how can metaphysical inquiry proceed in a way that remains open-ended, rigorously explores foundational questions, and integrates insights from both subjective experience and objective science?
How? Wow, that's a killer question. How? Psychedelics don't hurt in that respect. I think the best way is for people who have opposite perspectives to engage in a meaningful and charitable dialogue. And to tell you the truth, I think there's a tendency to narrow down our picture of the world to what makes the most sense to us, and dialogue with the other compels us to actually engage and grapple with a way of seeing the world which is fundamentally different from ours, and it reminds us that this thing that I was kind of I touched on a little bit, that modernity has created this magic circle into which we've stepped, where it's sort of like a spell of forgetfulness, and we've forgotten that there are more things in heaven and earth than exist in your philosophy, Horatio. Like the universe is stranger than we can possibly imagine, and what we're doing when we're making sense of it is we're narrowing it down so we can fit it inside our tiny little heads, but it's bigger than us. It's bigger than any individual. It's bigger than humans in general, and the encounter with the other gives us evidence that there are other ways of experiencing and making sense of the world other than our own, and that the world as such includes all those ways. All those ways work and coexist, and so our picture of the world needs to include an openness to those other ways, and we need to constantly remind ourselves that it is stranger than we can imagine.
Beautiful. All right, thanks, Insync. Cool chatting with you today.
Yeah,
Great conversation as usual.
awesome. Look forward to next time.